All right, so without wasting much time, let's start. So today's lecture mainly will be looking at the glomerular filtration rate and also the factors that affect the glomerular filtration rate that takes place within the kidney. So this diagram here is a summary of what we looked at last time we had a class. I was just summarizing the function of the kidney nephron, of which I told you to say that the kidney nephron is involved in filtration, secretion, reabsorption, and excretion. So all that mechanism you are able to appreciate in this slide. So I'm not going to waste time explaining what I've already explained in the previous lecture that we had. So we proceed to today's lecture objectives. You're going to be able to define the glomerular filtration rate. So it means at the end of the class, you should be able to define the glomerular filtration rate. You should also be able to describe how it is measured. So how the glomerular filtration rate is measured. Then you should also be able to explain the major factors affecting the glomerular filtration rate. So what are the factors that will affect the glomerular filtration rate? So those that are increasing the glomerular filtration rate and those that are decreasing the glomerular filtration rate, you should be able to describe those factors. So they will have an effect on the function of the kidney. So anything that will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate, it will also have an effect on the function of the kidney. So the glomerular filtration rate, how can you define it? The glomerular filtration rate is defined as the total volume of fluid filtered by the glomeruli per unit time. So it's simply the total volume of fluid filtered by the glomeruli per unit time. So remember, you have a lot of glomeruli in those two kidneys that each person has. So those glomeruli are the ones that are involved in filtration. So the total volume of fluid that is being filtered by all the glomeruli per unit time is referred to as glomerular filtration rate. So it is normally around 125 mils or milliliters per minute, of which we also discussed this the last time we had a lecture. And it's equivalent to about 180 liters per minute. So the glomerular filtration rate can also be defined as the total quantity of filtrate formed in all the nephron of both kidneys in a given unit time. So the given unit time here, it could be per minute or per day. So if per minute, you filter about 125 milliliter of plasma per minute. So that gives you the glomerular filtration rate. So in normal adults, the glomerular filtration rate ranges on average from 90 to 120 milliliters per minute. So this is in males. So males, they have a higher glomerular filtration rate as compared to females, which makes sense because when you're looking at plasma volume, males, they have more plasma as compared to females. So if males, they have more plasma, it means even when it comes to kidneys, they need to do a lot of work. Even when it comes to muscle mass, males, they have more muscle mass as compared to females. So there are a lot of metabolism that are taking place there. There's a lot of production of byproducts that are coming from metabolism that needs to be filtered at the kidney. So even the size of the kidneys, they are bigger in males as compared to females. So the glomerular filtration rate on average, it's higher in males as compared to females. In females, it will range from 80 to 125 milliliters per minute. So that is in females. But on average, we'll just say an adult should have the glomerular filtration rate of somewhere around 125. That's the most common one. So we'll just say 125 mils per minute. But you need to know that the males, they will have more as compared to females. So the glomerular filtration rate is more in males as compared to females in terms of the value. Okay, so the glomerular filtration rate, which is also defined as the volume of fluid filtered from the glomerular capillaries into the Bowman's space per unit time. So how much are you filtering these fluids into the Bowman space. So if you come up with the volume of the fluid that are being filtered per minute, that will still give you the glomerular filtration rate. So the glomerular filtration rate is simply because of the glomerulus that is involved in filtration. Remember, there are structures that are contributing to the glomerulus. So there's what we call the filtration membrane, or the glomerular filtration membrane, that is responsible for filtering these fluids that are coming in. So you can see in this diagram here that you have the glomerulus, and the glomerulus, we have two arterials. So you have the afferent arteriole that will divide into the capillaries, and then they will join to form the efferent arteriole at the end. And then this efferent arteriole, it will become the peritubular capillaries, vasa lacta, then it goes back into the venous circulation. But the membrane I'm interested in is the barrier between the Bowman space and the capillaries. You know, to say that you have two major cells that are forming this barrier, of which we said you have the podocytes and also the endothelial cells that are sitting on the basement membrane. So that will be the structure that is separating the Bowman space from the capillaries. So whatever needs to move from the capillaries into the Bowman space, it needs to cross the barrier, which is called the filtration membrane. So this filtration membrane, you can see it's expanded on the other side here. So there are forces that will allow movement of fluids from the capillaries into the Bowman space via the cells I'm talking about. So in this illustration, you can see the cells here. So we have the endothelial cells that is lining the capillaries in the glomerulus. Then you also have the food processes of podocytes that will also form part of the barrier. So whatever is moving from the capillaries, it has to cross the cells here to go into the Bowman space. This is the filtration taking place. So there are steering forces that will facilitate movement of fluids to move from the capillaries into the Bowman space. So the first force, which is very important for you to note, is called the hydrostatic pressure. So the hydrostatic pressure is due to the presence of water molecules. So the more water molecules you're going to have here, the more hydrostatic pressure you're going to have. Then also the blood pressure itself. So if the heart is pumping with stronger force, you know, to say that the blood pressure is going to increase, then the blood flow is also going to increase to the kidney. That will also have an effect on the hydrostatic pressure. So this hydrostatic pressure will now push the fluids to move from the capillary to go into the Bowman space via these cells that I've mentioned that will form the barrier here. Then there are also opposing force to the hydrostatic pressure. So the hydrostatic pressure is the major force that will force the fluids to move from the capillaries to go into the Bowman space across the filtration membrane itself. Then on top of that, you have other forces. So as you are filtering the fluids into the Bowman space, there will be a buildup of fluids within the Bowman space. That will also create hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space. So the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space is the opposing pressure to the hydrostatic pressure that is found within the capillaries. So it will be negative pressure because it's opposing the filtration process. Then you also have another pressure, which is called the colloidal pressure or oncotic pressure. So you have the colloidal osmotic pressure that is due to the presence of proteins. So you know, to say that proteins are so big to the extent that they are not being filtered by this membrane. So they are confined within the cardiovascular system, or they are confined within the capillaries. Because of that, you realize to say that the plasma proteins, most of them, they are negatively charged. So because they are negatively charged, they are going to create attraction force. So they are attracting water molecules. So because they are attracting water molecules, they would want to retain fluids within the capillaries. So it will also be an opposing pressure. So both the colloidal pressure in the capillaries and the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space, these are opposing pressure to the filtration pressure. So we are going to calculate the net filtration pressure, comparing this pressure that are facilitating or inhibiting filtration. So you need to understand the steering forces that can facilitate or inhibit filtration. The other factor that you need to pay attention to is the polarity of the filtration membrane or the charge of the filtration membrane. You know to say that the filtration membrane is composed of endothelial cells, and the endothelial cells, they are covered by some glycoproteins and also other proteins that are covering them. So those proteins are negatively charged. So you find that the membrane, the filtration membrane, is negatively charged. So that will also have an effect on the substances that needs to be filtered. So those substances that are negatively charged, the anions, it's very difficult for them to be filtered here. That's why even plasma proteins, they can't be filtered here. Why? It's because most of the plasma proteins are phosphorylated, so they'll be carrying a negative charge. So they can't be filtered here because the membrane itself is negatively charged. So anything that is negatively charged, it's very difficult for it to be filtered by the kidneys because the membrane itself is also negatively charged. So there will be that force of repulsion. You know, to say negative, negative, there is repulsion. Negative, positive, there is attraction. So it means to say that anything that is positively charged, it can easily be filtered here. So all the electrolytes that are negatively charged, they can easily be filtered by the filtration membrane. Because the filtration membrane is negatively charged, then it will start attracting those positive electrolytes or positive cations that can easily be filtered, like sodium, magnesium. All those that are positively charged can easily be filtered here. But chloride, even chloride, can be filtered, but with some difficulties because the membrane itself is negatively charged. So I needed just to mention that before we proceed. Okay. So we proceed. So the production of the ultrafiltrate. So now we are looking at the process of filtration itself. So the production of an ultrafiltrate or the plasma by the glomeruli. So you are looking at the production of the ultrafiltrate, which is the filtration process. The ultrafiltration is driven by steering forces, like I mentioned, across the glomerular capillaries. So these steering forces are hydrostatic and oncotic pressure that we are going to compare here. Then we'll come up with the equation for the filtration. So the filtration equation that is affected by the steering forces. So changes in these forces and in the renal plasma flow alter the glomerular filtration rate. So the changes in these forces and in renal plasma flow will alter the glomerular filtration rate because the changes in the forces. So if you have an increase in hydrostatic pressure in the capillaries, that can encourage filtration. If you have an increase in the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman's capsule, that will reduce filtration to some extent. If you have an increase in the oncotic pressure in the capillaries, that can also reduce filtration. So remember, you have forces that will encourage filtration and others will try to oppose the filtration process. But the ultrafiltrate lacks cellular elements. So the ultrafiltrate is what you are getting after filtration. So whatever is passing across the filtration membrane becomes the ultrafiltrate. So the ultrafiltrate lacks cellular elements and it's protein-free. It means that there are no cells that are being filtered at this membrane. Remember, you have some openings which are called fenestrations that can allow movement of tiny molecules. But cells like white blood cells, red blood cells, they are very big, they can't be filtered there. Then you also have proteins. So proteins can also not be filtered there because they are so big and most of them, they are negatively charged. So proteins are not being filtered, cells are not being filtered. So the ultrafiltrate won't contain cells, it won't contain protein in simple terms. So because the ultrafiltrate doesn't contain protein, it means that the oncotic pressure in the Bowman space, it's almost zero. Why? It's because there you don't find proteins. Proteins are not being filtered, and the proteins are the ones that will create the oncotic pressure. So because the ultrafiltrate doesn't contain a lot of proteins, it means that the oncotic pressure in the Bowman space, it's almost zero. So you need to know that as well. The concentrations of salts of organic molecules like glucose, amino acids are similar in plasma and ultrafiltrate. So those things that are freely filtered, you find that their concentration, when you compare the ultrafiltrate and plasma, it will be almost the same. So the ultrafiltrate, the concentration of glucose, amino acids in the ultrafiltrate is the same to that of plasma. Remember, the ultrafiltrate is before now you start talking about the function of the kidney nephron that is involved in reabsorption and secretion. So before you start modifying the ultrafiltrate, the electrolyte composition of the ultrafiltrate is similar to that of plasma. But with time, as the ultrafiltrate is moving within the kidney nephron, there is modification that is taking place that involves reabsorption and also secretion of certain molecules. And then the concentration differs now when you compare it to that of plasma, concentration of electrolytes. Then on top of this, there is what we call autoregulation. So the autoregulation is going to hold the glomerular filtration rate and the renal plasma flow within the very narrow ranges. It means that despite having changes in the blood pressure out there, the kidneys, it has got its own mechanism to regulate its own blood supply and also renal plasma flow. So you find that it has to be regulated because the glomerular filtration rate has to be maintained within the acceptable range to enhance the function of the kidneys. So because now you want to maintain the glomerular filtration rate, it means that the kidneys should have control on the factors that will have an influence on the glomerular filtration rate. So blood pressure is one of them. So you find that there is autoregulation. There are mechanisms within the kidney itself that will control blood pressure, or it will control the blood flow to the kidneys. So those are called autoregulatory mechanisms. So most of the organs, they do have autoregulatory mechanisms, but the autoregulatory mechanisms of the kidneys are so strong because the kidneys are involved in excretion, they are involved in filtration. So you want to always filter byproducts, you want to filter drugs, you want to filter foreign substances that are being introduced into the body. So the blood flow to the kidneys, they have to be regulated so that if you are hypertensive or if you are hypotensive, but the blood flow to the kidneys should be maintained within the acceptable ranges. That's why we have auto-regulatory mechanism. So towards the end of this lecture, I will explain the specific auto-regulatory mechanisms that are involved there. Okay. So this is the filtration that is taking place. It's basically the same thing, but now I'm explaining the steering forces that will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. So I've already explained about the filtration membrane and the other factors that are affecting the filtration membrane. So we have the afferent arteriole that is coming from the arterial circulation. Then you have the efferent. So this arterial, the afferent arteriole is the one that is going to divide to form the glomerular capillary. So you can see you have this smaller capillary. Then the blood is brought about because of renal blood flow. So you have blood that is channeled to the kidneys. So we say that is 22% of the cardiac output, if you remember very well. So that 22% of cardiac output is going to the kidneys, to the both kidneys. So the blood flow that is going to the kidneys is going to introduce fluids in the capillaries, in the glomerular capillaries. That will build up hydrostatic pressure, and that hydrostatic pressure is going to force things to be filtered across the membrane, the filtration membrane. So we have hydrostatic pressure in the glomerular capillaries. This is a major force that will now move substances across the glomerular membrane. Then we have the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space. So hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space. So this is the opposing pressure because now as the fluids are being filtered here, and then they'll start accumulating within the Bowman space. So the presence of fluids within the Bowman space will also create hydrostatic pressure. But now these fluids would want to go back into the capillaries. So that is the opposing force to that of filtration pressure. Then on top of that, I explained to say we have oncotic pressure. So we have oncotic pressure in the glomerular capillaries. This oncotic pressure is also the opposing pressure to filtration pressure. Why? It's because proteins are not being filtered here. So as you are filtering fluids here, the concentration of these proteins is going to increase as you are approaching the efferent arteriole. So if the concentration of these plasma proteins is increasing, it simply means that the oncotic pressure is also going to increase. So this increase in the oncotic pressure is going to create a negative pressure here because it's attracting water molecules. Most of these plasma proteins are negatively charged, so they'll start attracting water molecules. So they would want to retain water within the capillaries. So that would be another opposing pressure. Then since we are not filtering any of these proteins, if the kidneys are intact and there's no pathology that is damaging the filtration membrane, so all the plasma proteins are not being filtered here. So it means that the concentration of proteins in the Bowman space is almost zero. Because of that, the oncotic pressure in the Bowman space is also almost zero. So you don't have the oncotic pressure in the Bowman space because you don't have the proteins. So there are mainly three forces that you're interested in: the hydrostatic pressure in the glomerular capillaries, then the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space, which is opposing, then also the oncotic pressure in the glomerular capillaries that is also opposing the filtration process. So the filtration pressure is the change in the hydrostatic pressure minus the change in the oncotic pressure. So if you get the difference of hydrostatic pressure here, then you subtract the difference of oncotic pressure here, you're going to get the filtration pressure. So the net filtration pressure, you need to consider all the stirring forces. So there is still another equation to simplify that. The dynamics of ultrafiltration. So simply discussing the stirring forces. The ultrafiltration pressure, which is the actual filtration pressure, is simply the difference between the net hydrostatic pressure and the net oncotic pressure across the glomerular filtration barrier. So the net hydrostatic pressure, the difference between the net hydrostatic pressure and the net oncotic pressure across the glomerular filtration barrier is called the ultrafiltrate pressure, the ultrafiltration pressure. So the ultrafiltration pressure is what is going now to facilitate the movement of fluids and other substances across the filtration membrane, like I've already explained. So the net ultrafiltration pressure drives fluids from the lumen or the glomerular capillaries across the filtration barrier into the Bowman space. But there are factors that are accompanied with the filtration membrane. Remember, we say that there are forces. So when you're getting the net difference between the hydrostatic pressure and the oncotic pressure, it will give you the ultrafiltration pressure. But there are also other factors that are provided by the filtration membrane. So some of those factors is the permeability of the filtration membrane. So the permeability of the filtration membrane and also the surface area for filtration. So the surface area where filtration is taking place. So all those factors, they are summarized into what we call the filtration coefficients. So the filtration coefficients, it will summarize other factors like the permeability of the membrane, the charge of the membrane, and also the surface area in which the ultrafiltrate are being filtered. So the filtration coefficient is measured, it's a constant value. So it's about 12.5 meters squared per minute per millimeter of mercury. So this is the filtration coefficient, which is a standard or it's a constant. So you need to factor it in when you are calculating the ultrafiltration pressure. So the ultrafiltration pressure is equal to the filtration coefficient multiplied by the difference between the net hydrostatic pressure. So the net hydrostatic pressure, it will be the hydrostatic pressure in the glomerular capillary minus the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space. Then you subtract the net oncotic pressure. So the net oncotic pressure is the oncotic pressure in the glomerular capillary minus the oncotic pressure in the Bowman space. So the values there, you know to say that in the Bowman space, the oncotic pressure is almost 0. Okay. So I'll show you the values. So these are the values. So now the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary is about 60 millimeter of mercury. Then the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space is about 18 millimeter of mercury. Then the oncotic pressure in the capillary is about 32 millimeter of mercury. The oncotic pressure in the Bowman space is about 0 millimeter of mercury. So if you multiply this, if you do your math here, if you use your calculator, when you say 60 minus 18, then the value that you're going to get there minus 32, what you're going to get is 10. Then I've told you to say that the filtration coefficient is 12.5. So the glomerular filtration, so the ultrafiltration pressure will simply give you the glomerular filtration rate. So the glomerular filtration rate is equal to the filtration coefficient minus the difference in the net hydrostatic pressure and oncotic pressure. So that difference is 10. So 12.5 multiplied by 10, it will give you 125 milliliter per minute. It means that your glomerular filtration rate, on average, it's 125 mils per minute. So every 1 minute, the kidneys, they will filter about 125 mils of plasma. I hope I'm communicating. So this is your glomerular filtration rate. So it's the filtration coefficient multiplied by the difference in the net hydrostatic pressure and oncotic pressure, of which I've already explained the starting forces. Okay, so this slide is the same. So these are the factors that will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. So to start with, you have the capillary hydrostatic pressure variations that will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. So change in the systemic blood pressure. For instance, if you have change, maybe you have an increase in blood pressure, it means that even renal plasma flow is going to increase because you have an increase in blood pressure. But remember, we said that the kidneys, they have autoregulatory mechanism that will try to resist the blood pressure in the kidneys when you are hypertensive to some extent. So there is a range in which the autoregulatory mechanism, they can operate. Otherwise, outside that range, they are not that effective to cause autoregulation. So the capillary hydrostatic pressure variations, it can be brought about because of change in the systemic blood pressure, of course. So the blood pressure will have an effect on the hydrostatic pressure. Then also the constriction of afferent or efferent arterioles. So if you have vasoconstriction, if you have vasodilatation, all that will have an effect on hydrostatic pressure. Then the colloidal osmotic pressure changes. So the colloidal osmotic pressure changes is due to the presence of proteins. So in case of dehydration, if you are dehydrated, it means that you don't have much of water in the body. So there will be hemoconcentration of plasma protein. So the plasma protein's concentration is going to increase. Why? It's because you have less water. So if the concentration of plasma protein is increasing, it means that the oncotic pressure is going to increase, and that will cause filtration. So you find that if oncotic pressure is increasing, the glomerular filtration rate is going to decrease. In case of malnutrition, maybe you are lacking proteins, plasma proteins, or maybe the kidneys are not producing enough plasma proteins, then the concentration of plasma proteins is going to affect. So malnutrition has got an effect on colloidal osmotic pressure, which will also have an effect on glomerular filtration rate. Hydrostatic pressure changes in the Bowman space. So whatever is going to change the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space will have an effect on filtration rate, glomerular filtration rate. So if you have an increase, the glomerular filtration rate is going to decrease. If you have an increase in the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space, then the glomerular filtration rate is going to decrease. If you have a decrease in the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space, the glomerular filtration rate is going to increase because the opposing force is going to decrease. So what can cause an increase in the hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space? There are certain conditions like ureteral obstruction. In the ureteral obstruction, meaning that the ureters are obstructed, maybe due to kidney stones, or maybe there's inflammation taking place there, and then there's obstruction of the ureters, then there will be buildup of fluids within the Bowman space. That will cause an increase in hydrostatic pressure in the Bowman space. Then edema of the kidney, there's accumulation of fluids in the kidney. So there's also accumulation of fluids in the Bowman space that will increase the Bowman space hydrostatic pressure. It will also have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. So there'll be a decrease in the glomerular filtration rate when that happens. So all these factors will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. Okay. So the forces, I think I've already explained. So you can see in this diagram that the glomerular hydrostatic pressure is 60 millimeter of mercury. That is facilitating filtration. And those that are opposing the filtration are two. The Bowman space hydrostatic pressure, which is about 18, and also the choroidal osmotic pressure in the glomerular. So that is about 32 millimeter of mercury. So coming down here, the net filtration pressure is equal to the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, which is 60, minus the Bowman's capsule pressure, which is 18 millimeter of mercury, and also the oncotic pressure is negative. So when you subtract this, you're going to get 10. So 10 will be the net filtration pressure. So this is the glomerular filtration pressure to some extent. The glomerular filtration pressure or the net filtration pressure is somewhere around 10 millimeter of mercury. So this is what is facilitating the movement of fluids actually to move from the capillaries into the Bowman space across the filtration membrane here, and all those factors that I mentioned. So towards the end, I'll also discuss some more factors that will have an effect on the filtration membrane. Okay, so measurement of the glomerular filtration rates. So there are certain substances that you can use to estimate the glomerular filtration rate. So when you're estimating the glomerular filtration rate, you are simply carrying out the kidney function tests. So you want to assess how the kidneys are operating, whether the glomerular filtration rate is within the acceptable range, or it has reduced, or it has increased. So in certain disease conditions, you find that the glomerular filtration rate is increasing, and in others, maybe it's reducing. So you need to do kidney function tests. But for you to do the kidney function test, you also need to know the glomerular filtration rate there, whether the kidneys, they are filtering enough or not. So what can you use to estimate the glomerular filtration rate? So there are substances that you can use to estimate the glomerular filtration rate, but there is a criteria in which you're going to use these substances. You don't just pick any substance. Just like when we are estimating body fluid compartments like plasma, total body water, there were some substances that we are using, but they should have specific characteristics for you to use them. Okay, so the characteristics for kidney function tests, you want to estimate the glomerular filtration rate. So what are the substances that you can use? So I said you can't just pick on any substance. You need to have a substance that will at least meet the requirements for it to be used. So the criteria for use of a substance to measure glomerular filtration rate, what are you looking for from these substances? So the first one, of course, the substance must be freely filtered in the glomeruli. So you need something that can freely be filtered in the glomeruli, not proteins, plasma proteins that are not filtered. Because what you're interested here, you want to estimate the glomerular filtration rate. So you need a substance that can freely be filtered by the glomeruli. Then the substance must be neither reabsorbed nor secreted by the renal tubules. So this substance that you are filtering, it's not supposed to be reabsorbed or secreted by the renal tubules, because if there is reabsorption taking place, it will have an effect on the concentration, the final concentration. If there is secretion taking place, it will also have an effect on the final concentration of the substance that you're using. So this substance must be neither reabsorbed nor secreted by the renal tubules. Then the substance must not be synthesized or broken down or accumulated by the kidney, meaning that the metabolism of the kidney shouldn't have an effect on this substance, because if it's reacting within the kidney, its concentration will also be affected. So you want to get the final concentration of the substance that was filtered by the filtration membrane. Then the substance must be physiologically innate, meaning that non-toxic, the substance which is not toxic and without effect on the renal function. So these are the characteristics that a substance should have. So what are some of these substances that you can use to estimate glomerular filtration rate? Such questions can also come in MCQs. So the first one is inulin. So you can also use inulin. So the glomerular filtration rate can be determined by injecting inulin or inulin analog sinistrine into the plasma. So you can use inulin, you can use substances that look like inulin. An example is sinistrine into plasma. So inulin was the same substances that we are using to estimate some of the body fluid compartments, if you remember very well. But here, the inulin that you are using here, you want to estimate glomerular filtration rate. Why? It's because the same substance, inulin, can be freely filtered by the glomeruli. Then it's non-toxic, it's not being reabsorbed, it's not being secreted. So you find that you can use it to estimate the glomerular filtration rate. So since both inulin and sinistrine are neither reabsorbed nor secreted by the kidney after glomerular filtration, okay, so they are not reabsorbed, they are not secreted. So it means that what you get as your final concentration will be what was being filtered by the glomeruli. So their rate of excretion is directly proportional to the rate of filtration. So the rate of excretion of inulin is directly proportional to the rate of filtration. So you'll be able to estimate the glomerular filtration membrane. The glomerular filtration rate. So the inulin clearance slightly overestimates the glomerular function. What I mean is the inulin clearance itself, it will slightly overestimate the glomerular filtration rate. Why? It's because you realize to say that after filtration of inulin, the concentration of inulin is going to increase. Why? It's because as the urine is passing through the kidney nephron, there is some sort of reabsorption of water, not inulin itself. There is reabsorption of water. So if you are reabsorbing water, the final concentration of inulin is going to increase. So it's increasing, not that the amount of inulin is increasing, no, but it's because there is some of a reabsorption of water that will have an effect on the concentration of inulin. So the final inulin that you're going to get is going to have a higher concentration as compared to the ultrafiltrate immediately after filtration when you compare the two values. So the concentration of inulin in the urine sample that you're going to collect is going to be more as compared to the concentration of inulin just after filtration. That's what I mean. That is because of some of the water is being reabsorbed. So the concentration of inulin is increasing. That will overestimate the glomerular filtration rate. Because what you're going to know is this is the concentration of inulin. It means that this is what was being filtered. So if you use that concentration, you're going to have a value that is slightly larger than the actual filtration rate because of the concentration. So in early stage of renal disease, the inulin clearance may remain normal due to hyperfiltration in the remaining kidney nephrons. What I mean here is when you're doing kidney function, you're using inulin to estimate the glomerular filtration rate. But sometimes when the disease is just starting, you might not get the correct renal filtration rate. Why? It's because if some of the kidney nephrons are not functioning well, there could be some hyperfiltration by the other kidney nephron to compensate those that are not functioning well. So it's very difficult for you to know whether the glomerular filtration rate is reducing at this point. That's why in early stage of renal disease, the inulin clearance may remain normal due to hyperfiltration in the remaining kidney nephron. But with time, you'll be able to see that the glomerular filtration rate is reducing because most of the kidney nephron now are affected. So incomplete urine collection is an important source of error in inulin clearance measurement. So when you're doing the glomerular filtration rate measurement, you need to collect the urine and you measure the concentration of inulin in the urine. So sometimes if you don't collect all the urine that is being produced within the period of 24 hours, what you're going to get, the values there will be affected because the concentration will also be affected. The volume of urine that you are collecting maybe is not enough. So that can bring about error in calculating the glomerular filtration rate. So it's something that you need to consider once you start practicing. Okay, so here's a diagram that is just summarizing what I'm explaining. So we want to estimate the glomerular filtration rate using inulin. So you inject inulin into the blood vessels, then inulin will be distributed within the body. Then part of it now will start being filtered by the kidney. Because remember, the body will always try to get rid of whatever is foreign that is being introduced into the body. So once introduced inulin, the kidneys will try by all means to filter much of it because it's freely filtered by the glomeruli. So you can see here, there's blood flow that is supplying the kidney. So you have the glomeruli that is involved in a filtering of inulin. So inulin will be filtered here. It's freely being filtered. It's not being reabsorbed. It's not being secreted. So whatever is being filtered here will be collected in the urine. And that will give you a picture of the glomerular filtration rate because you compare the concentrations here. So now I've already told you to say that this inulin can overestimate the glomerular filtration rate. Why? It's because the concentration of inulin in the urine is going to increase due to water reabsorption. So here in the kidney nephron, you are reabsorbing a lot of water. So the concentration of inulin is increasing. So when you compare the concentration of inulin in the urine sample with that is just being filtered here, it will be different. Here it will be more as compared to that is being filtered here because of that effect. So now the amount of inulin that is being excreted in the urine per unit time or per given time is equal to the amount of inulin that is being filtered here because it's not being reabsorbed, it's not being secreted. So whatever is being filtered here is being excreted. That's why we are having this equation to say the amount excreted per given time is equal to the amount filtered per given time. Because there is no reabsorption, there is no secretion. So this equation, you can also say that the amount that is being excreted per unit time is equal to the urinary inulin concentration multiplied by the urine volume that is collected over the unit time. It's the same. So the urinary inulin concentration here multiplied by the urine volume collected over the given period of time, maybe for 24 hours or for 1 minute, but mainly it's for 24 hours. So urine volume per unit time, this will give you the urine flow rate. So this is the flow rate of urine, how urine is flowing into the kidney nephron. So the urine flow rate it's given by this equation. So you know to say that this is equal to the amount filtered per time. It's the same as the plasma inulin concentration multiplied by the filtered volume per unit time. So these equations are just the same. It's the same language actually. So in terms of units, so you have urinary inulin concentration. Concentration is given in grams per liter. So the concentration of inulin in the urine is given in grams per liter multiplied by the volume, the urine volume per unit time. This is the flow rate of urine. So the flow rate of urine is given in mils per minute. So mils per minute. That will be equal to plasma inulin concentration, which is also given, concentration is given in grams per liter. Then you multiply it by the glomerular filtration rate. How does it come in here? So you have filtered volume per time. So I've told you to say that the amount of fluids that are being filtered per time, that is the definition for glomerular filtration rate. So this will be glomerular filtration rate. That is also given in mils per minute. So now making the glomerular filtration rate the subject to the formula. We are driving the formula now. So making the glomerular filtration rate as a subject to the formula, you just need to divide this side by the inulin concentration in plasma. Even the other side, you divide by the inulin concentration in plasma. So it means that the glomerular filtration rate will be equal to the inulin concentration in the urine divided by the inulin concentration in plasma multiplied by the urine flow, which is the volume of urine collected over the period of time, which is given in mils per minute. So this now becomes the equation that you're going to use to estimate the glomerular filtration rates. So if you know the amount or the concentration of inulin that you are giving to this particular patient, and then you collect your blood sample, you measure the concentration of inulin in the blood sample, it means that now you have the concentration of inulin in plasma. Then you collect urine for the period of 24 hours. Then you measure the concentration of inulin in that urine. You are going to have the concentration of inulin in the urine that has been collected over the period of 24 hours. Then you multiply it with the urine flow, which is given in mils per minute. So if you've collected 2 liters of urine in 24 hours, so you're going to have 2 liters of urine in 24 hours. You are going to convert it into mils per minute, which is simple and straightforward. So with these variables, you are able to calculate the glomerular filtration rate. Okay, so the glomerular filtration rate there, it can be calculated to be 120 or 125 mils per minute, which is also giving you the similar value with the previous equation. Remember, the previous equation we said that the glomerular filtration rate is about 125 milliliter per minute. So even this new equation that we are using now, which is more practical, it will also give you similar values. So you can see here that you have the glomerular filtration rate of 120 to about 125 milliliter per minute. So in a clinical scenario question, it means that if I give you the concentration of maybe inulin in plasma, then the concentration of inulin in the urine, then I also give you the amount of urine that has been collected over the period of 24 hours. You should be able to calculate the glomerular filtration rate. So think of diseases that can have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. Then I can give you some values, which are variables. Then you can use them to calculate the glomerular filtration rate. Okay, so you know how I bring questions by now. I like a lot of these clinical scenario questions. Okay, but in clinical setups, so I can hear some background, Mike. Maveta. So guys, if you're not interested in the lecture, it's better you don't even join at all. Not whereby you are just laughing in the background. That is going to discourage our lecture. So if you're not interested, don't join. I don't mind having 2 students who are paying attention to what I'm explaining rather than you just wasting my time. Okay. So in a clinical setup, we don't use inulin. Rather, we use creatinine. So the creatinine clearance is used to estimate glomerular filtration rates. Why? It's because creatinine is being produced by the muscles. Remember, the metabolic processes that will provide energy for muscle activities. Remember, we have the phosphocreatine-creatine system. In that equation, there's production of creatinine. So creatinine is produced by the muscles. It's a byproduct of the muscles. So it can also be used to measure glomerular filtration rate. So it can be filtered, it's freely filtered, but some small amount is being reabsorbed and secreted. So it will have it will have an effect on the actual glomerular filtration rate. Okay, so instead of using inulin that you need to inject from an external source, you can use a substance that is being naturally produced by the body itself. So creatinine is produced naturally by the body. So the creatinine is a breakdown product of creatine phosphate, which is found in the muscle. So this creatinine, once it has been excreted by, or maybe it has been exocytosed by the cells, it can be filtered by the kidneys for the excretion of creatinine. So it is freely filtered by the glomerulus, but also actively secreted by the peritubular capillaries in small quantities, such that creatinine clearance is going to overestimate the actual glomerular filtration rate, because some of it is being secreted on top of what is being filtered. So the final concentration, it won't give you the picture of what is being filtered, because some of it is being secreted by the peritubular capillaries. That's what I mean. So because of that, the creatinine is going to overestimate the glomerular filtration rate by 10 to 20%. But this marginal error is acceptable. The fact that it's overestimating the glomerular filtration rate, the mechanisms that are there, or the methods that are there to estimate the concentration of creatinine in the urine, they have been designed in such a way that they are going to underestimate the concentration of creatinine in the urine by the same percentage, 10 to 20%, so that the percentage that you are getting is actually what is being filtered. You are getting rid of the percentage that is being secreted back into the kidney nephron. So the methods that are there to estimate the creatinine levels in the urine, or the creatinine concentration in the urine, they are going to underestimate the concentration by 10 to 20%. That will cover the marginal error, okay? But otherwise, the marginal error is also acceptable, considering the ease with which creatinine clearance is measured. So it's very easy to measure the creatinine clearance. So it means that it can be used to estimate glomerular filtration rate rather than using inulin. So inulin is more practical, not necessarily more practical, but it's going to give you accurate results, because none of it is being reabsorbed, none of it is being secreted. Creatinine is being produced by the body, so you don't have to inject anything into the patient. You can just measure the concentration of creatinine in the urine and also the concentration in the blood sample when you collect your blood sample. So it's very easy for you to use creatinine. So in clinical setups, we're going to use creatinine to estimate glomerular filtration rates. In experiments where you want to be very accurate, you can use inulin, okay? So you need to measure the concentration of creatinine in the urine that has been collected over the period of 24 hours. So you need to collect urine for 24 hours, then you measure the concentration of creatinine in the urine that has been collected for 24 hours. Then you also collect the blood sample where you measure the concentration of creatinine in the plasma. So once you have the concentration of creatinine in the plasma, in the urine, then you know the urine flow, the amount of urine that you've collected over the period of 24 hours, you'll be able to calculate the urine flow there. Then with those variables, you'll be able to calculate or to estimate the glomerular filtration rate. Okay. So this is the equation now. So it's the same. So we say that the glomerular filtration rate is equal to the inulin concentration in the urine divided by the inulin concentration in plasma multiplied by the urine flow. So here is the same here. So you have the creatinine clearance. So the creatinine clearance is equal to the creatinine concentration in the urine multiplied by the urine flow divided by the concentration of creatinine in plasma. So once you have these values, you'll be able to calculate the clearance for creatinine. So the creatinine clearance is going to estimate the glomerular filtration rate. So once I give you these variables, you should be able to calculate. It becomes very easy. Moving on to filtration fraction. What is filtration fraction? So the filtration fraction is the portion of plasma that is filtered. So what portion of plasma is being filtered per unit time? That is called filtration fraction. So it's given by the glomerular filtration rate that you've estimated using creatinine or you've used inulin, divide by the renal plasma flow. So you divide by the renal plasma flow. So there is a difference between renal plasma flow and renal blood flow. Renal blood flow, we said, is 22% of your cardiac output. So 22% of your cardiac output is going to the kidneys, which will translate into 1.1 liter per minute. So 1.1 liter per minute is going to the kidneys, of which we say that what is going to the kidneys, the plasma that is transported to the kidneys. You know, to say plasma is 55% of the whole blood. So if you have 1.1 liter, if you get the 55% of 1.1 liter, you get something like 605 mils. So 605 mils is actually the renal plasma flow. That is the plasma that is transported to the kidneys, to the two kidneys, without the cells. So the filtration fraction is calculated as a glomerular filtration rate, which you've already estimated using creatinine or using inulin. Then you divide by the renal plasma flow. So the renal plasma flow ranges from 600 to 700 mils. So let's just get the maximum, which is 700 mils. So if you say 125 mils, this is what is being filtered, because we said renal glomerular filtration rate is somewhere around 125 mils per minute. So divide by the renal plasma flow. Renal plasma flow is about 600 to 700 mils per minute. So 125 divided by 700, it will give you values from 0.15 to about 0.20, which is 15% to 20%. So it means that the filtration fraction is 15 to 20% of the renal plasma flow. So only about 15 to 20% of the renal plasma flow is being filtered. So if you have 100, okay, so we are looking at filtration fraction, of which I said filtration fraction is the portion of plasma that is being filtered. So you know, to say the renal plasma flow, you have 100% of renal plasma flow that is going to the kidneys. Remember, of course, I know to say 22% of the cardiac output. So we have 22% that is going to the kidneys, but let's say the amount that is going to the kidneys is 100%. So out of that 100%, how much is being filtered? So out of that 100%, only 15 to 20% is being filtered. The remaining 80 to 85% of renal plasma is going to continue through the glomerulars into the efferent arterioles and the peritubular capillaries. Finally, is retained to the systemic circulation in the renal vein. So out of the 100% of renal plasma flow, only 15 to 20% is being filtered. So that 15 to 20% that is being filtered is called filtration fraction. So the portion of plasma that is being filtered. So out of these 700 mils, only 125 mil is being filtered. So this 25 mil divided by 100, divide by 7,000 multiplied by 100, it will give you a value between 0.15 to 0.2. So about 80 to 85% is not being filtered. It will continue into the efferent arterioles, then the peritubular capillaries. Then it will return back to systemic circulation via the renal vein. That's what I mean. Okay. So now the filtration fraction, we said the formula is glomerular filtration rate divided by the renal plasma flow. So what can you use to estimate the glomerular filtration rate? We said inulin. So inulin clearance will give you the glomerular filtration rate, or if you want, you can use creatinine clearance, but inulin clearance is more accurate as compared to creatinine clearance. Then the renal plasma flow, there is a substance that you can use, the para-aminohippuric acid. Para-aminohippuric acid is the one that you're going to use to estimate renal plasma flow. So using para-aminopuric acid, you are going to estimate renal plasma flow. So once you get the two values, you divide, multiplied by 100, it will give you the filtration fraction. So filtration fraction, you divide the two values, it will give you a fraction, 0.15 or 0.2, somewhere around there. So I've already explained to say glomerular filtration rate is determined by the inulin clearance. Then the renal plasma flow is determined by para-aminopuric acid clearance. So this is what you use to estimate. But what is the clinical significance of the filtration fraction? So the filtration fraction, it will give you information about reabsorption by the renal tubules, or how efficient are the renal tubules to reabsorb the fluids. Remember, we said that the glomerular filtration rate is 125 milliliters per minute. If you convert that into per day, you're going to get 180 liters per day. So every day you are filtering about 180 liters per day. So much of this has to be reabsorbed because on average, a person is producing about 1 to 2 liters of urine. So if you are only producing 1 to 2 liters of urine, it means that most of the fluids that are being filtered are reabsorbed. So greater than 99% of the filtrate, it must be reabsorbed by the tubules. So this reabsorption, you can assess how good the reabsorption is taking place by calculating the filtration fraction. So that's the clinical significance of the filtration fraction, because you want to assess how good reabsorption is taking place. Kidney function tests. So what are the factors that will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate? So here is a list of factors that will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. So an essay can come to say, can you describe factors that has got an effect on the glomerular filtration rate? So a lot of factors. So it's a very good question for an essay. So the first one is the glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure. So the starting pressures that I've already explained. So you have hydrostatic pressure, we have the capillary oncotic pressure, then you have the Bowman space hydrostatic pressure. These 1, 2, 3 are starting forces. So in the Bowman's, we already said that you don't have oncotic pressure there because the proteins are not being filtered unless if there is a pathology that is taking place, damaging of the filtration membrane that can also allow filtration of plasma proteins. That will cause an increase in the Bowman's oncotic pressure. So it will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate as well. Okay, but under normal circumstances, we only consider the 3, which I've already explained. Then we also have hydraulic conductivity or permeability of the filtration membrane coupled with the surface area of the glomerular filtration. These two will give you the filtration coefficient. So you have the conductivity or the permeability of the filtration membrane. The conductivity, you're interested in the charge. So I've told you to say that the filtration membrane is negatively charged because of the glycoproteins that are covering the endothelial cells and the podocytes. So the membrane is negatively charged. Whatever is negatively charged, it's very difficult for it to be filtered. Those which are positively charged, they can easily be filtered. And also the permeability of the membrane, the opening of the membrane, those are called fenestrations. So those pores of the membrane, the fenestration, can also have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. The bigger they are, the more permeable it is. Okay, the smaller they are, the less permeable the membrane will be. Then also the surface area. How many of those glomeruli are actually participating in filtration? So the surface area that is involved in filtration will have an effect. Then the renal plasma flow. The renal plasma flow will have an effect because if you have an increase in the renal plasma flow, it means that, or renal blood flow. So if you have an increase in the renal blood flow, it means that even the hydrostatic pressure is going to increase because you're introducing a lot of fluids to the kidneys. So the glomeruli, they are receiving a lot of fluids because you have an increase in the renal blood flow. So if you have an increase in renal blood flow, even the glomerular filtration rate is also going to increase. Then we have tuberoglomerular feedback mechanism. The tuberoglomerular feedback mechanism, this is where the macular denser cells are involved. and the granular cells that are producing renin are also involved. So I'll explain towards the end. The constriction of the afferent arterioles. So the constriction of the afferent arterioles will bring about resistance of the afferent arterioles. So if you have constriction of the afferent arterioles, then there is less blood flow to the kidneys. If you have less blood flow to the kidneys, the hydrostatic pressure is going to reduce. The glomerular filtration rate is also going to reduce. If you have constriction of the efferent arteriole, the opposite will happen. So now the afferent will bring the blood flow to the kidneys, but now the blood can't easily move to the efferent because the efferent is constricting. So the lumen of the efferent is reduced. So the fluids can't easily move to the efferent. They will build up within the capsule. Then the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary, in the capsule capillaries is going to increase. So it means hydrostatic pressure is going to increase. Then the glomerular filtration rate is also going to increase. Systemic arterial pressure, if the blood pressure is increasing, you know to say that even the filtration pressure is also going to increase. If blood pressure is increasing, filtration is going to increase. The glomerular filtration rate will increase as well. The sympathetic stimulation will also have an effect. Why? It's because if you have sympathetic stimulation, it will bring about vasoconstriction. So that vasoconstriction, it can reduce blood flow to the kidneys, because if you have vasoconstriction, you are increasing the resistance. So there will be resistance. That resistance will reduce the blood flow to the kidneys, and then the hydrostatic pressure will reduce, and also the glomerular filtration rate will reduce to some extent. Contraction of mesangial cells. These mesangial cells are modified smooth muscle cells associated with the glomeruli. So the contraction of mesangial cells can also have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. So if they are contracting or relaxing, that will have an effect. So I'll explain in the next slide. Then we also have hormonal and other factors. There are other hormones that will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate, like angiotensin 2. So renin, angiotensin, aldosterone axis will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. Why? It's because angiotensin 2 can cause vasoconstriction of the afferent arterioles. So the afferent arterioles will constrict, and you know to say that hydrostatic pressure is going to reduce and glomerular filtration rate is going to reduce. That's why when you have high blood pressure, one of the regulatory mechanisms is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis, whereby the granular cells will produce a lot of renin. The renin will go into circulation. It will help to convert angiotensinogen produced by the liver into angiotensin 1. The angiotensin 1 will be transported by the cardiovascular system to the kidneys, and not to the kidneys, but to the lungs. And also the kidneys, they do have angiotensin converting enzymes, but most of these enzymes, they are found within the lungs. So in the lungs, they are going to convert the angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, because that's where you find a lot of angiotensin converting enzymes. The angiotensin 2 will go and have a lot of effect. So it's a vasoconstrictor. So if you have vasoconstriction, then overall blood pressure is going to increase. Then you know to say that the angiotensin 2 can also go to the adrenal glands to stimulate the production of aldosterone. So aldosterone production is going to increase, and this aldosterone will go and facilitate the reabsorption of sodium and water in the kidney nephron. So we'll look at those mechanisms later on. But just not to say that there are hormones that will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate, especially the renin hormone and angiotensin 2. Okay. So we proceed. The changes in the diameter of the afferent and the efferent arteriole, they will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. So the decreased glomerular filtration rate can be caused by the constriction of afferent arteriole. So you can see the afferent arteriole is the one that is bringing blood to the capsule, to the glomerulus. So if you have constriction of the afferent arteriole, then the blood flow is going to reduce. When you have reduction in the blood flow, it means that the hydrostatic pressure is going to reduce, and also the glomerular filtration rate is going to reduce. Then if you have dilatation of the efferent arteriole, it means that there will be no accumulation of fluids within the capsule. They can easily move to the efferent arteriole. So that will have an effect on the hydrostatic pressure. So the hydrostatic pressure in the capsule is going to reduce. Then also the glomerular filtration rate is going to reduce. The opposite will happen if you have constriction of the efferent arteriole. So if the efferent arteriole is reducing in diameter, there will be fluid accumulation within the capsule here, because the fluids can't easily move into the efferent because the diameter has reduced there. So there will be accumulation of fluids that will increase the glomerular, the hydrostatic pressure is going to increase. If you have an increase in the hydrostatic pressure, then it simply means that the glomerular filtration rate is also going to increase. So if I have an increase in the glomerular filtration rate, that is due to constriction of the efferent arterioles. Then if you have dilatation of the afferent arterioles, meaning that the afferent arterioles are increasing in diameter, or the lumen, then the blood flow to the kidneys is going to increase. If you increase the blood flow to the kidneys, you're increasing the fluids in the capsule. That will increase the the glomerular capillary hydrostatic pressure is going to increase. Then it means that even the glomerular filtration rate is going to increase. So these are the effects on the diameter of the afferent and the efferent arterioles, whether you have vasoconstriction or vasodilatation of the afferent or the efferent arterioles. So you need to know this effect. The relationship between the afferent and the efferent arterial resistance, and also renal blood flow and glomerular filtration rate. So the relationship between renal blood flow and also glomerular filtration rate, this will give you the filtration fraction to some extent. But mainly here, we're not interested in the renal blood flow. Rather, we're interested in the renal plasma flow. Because the renal plasma flow, we say that the filtration fraction is when you divide the glomerular filtration rate divided by the renal plasma flow. What you're going to get is a filtration fraction. So constriction of afferent arterioles. So if you have constriction of the afferent arterioles, it means that the renal plasma flow is going to reduce, the glomerular filtration rate is going to reduce, and also the renal plasma flow. Forget about the renal blood flow here, mainly it's renal plasma flow. So the renal plasma flow is going to reduce, then it will have no effect on the filtration fraction. Why? It's because both variables are reducing. The denominator and the numerator, they are reducing. It means that that fraction won't be affected in terms of the value, because both variables are reducing. If you have dilatation of the afferent arteriole, it means that you are increasing blood flow to the kidneys. The glomerular filtration rate is also going to increase. The renal plasma flow and blood flow is going to increase. Then there will be no change in the filtration fraction, because the numerator and the denominator, they are both increasing. So if the two variables are increasing, if you divide them, the value that you're going to get won't be affected. But dilatation of the efferent arteriole. So if you have dilatation of the efferent arteriole, you're going to have an increase in the renal plasma flow, but you're going to have a decrease in the glomerular filtration rate. Why? It's because the fluids do not spend much time in the Bowman's, in the glomerular. So if they're not spending much time in the glomerular, it means that the glomerular filtration rate is going to reduce, because the hydrostatic pressure is going to reduce. So if the renal plasma flow is increasing, but the glomerular filtration rate is reducing, if you divide the glomerular filtration rate divided by the renal plasma flow, it means that your filtration fraction is going to decrease, because the numerator is reducing, the denominator is increasing. So the filtration fraction is going to decrease. That will have an effect on reabsorption as well. Constriction of the efferent, then you can see the renal blood flow or renal plasma flow is reducing, the glomerular filtration rate is increasing, then the denominator is reducing, the numerator is increasing. It means that your fraction is going to increase. So you need to understand the relationship. What happens to the filtration fraction when you have vasodilatation of the efferent arteriole, or when you have vasoconstriction of the efferent arteriole, when you have vasodilatation of the afferent arteriole, when you have vasodilatation of the efferent arteriole. So in both cases, you need to know what will happen to the filtration fraction, and that will have an effect on the reabsorption, whether it will increase or decrease the reabsorption. Autoregulatory mechanism. Okay, so if you are not paying attention, at least now pay attention, because I've told you to say that the kidneys, they have their own way of regulating blood flow and plasma flow, so that the glomerular filtration rate is maintained within the acceptable range. There are feedback mechanisms which are intrinsic to the kidney. So these are feedback mechanisms which are intrinsic to the kidney, and they keep the renal blood flow and the glomerular filtration rates relatively constant despite changes in the arterial blood pressure. So you can have some variations in the arterial blood pressure, whether you are hypertensive, you are hypotensive, you are normotensive, but the kidneys, which are involved in excretion, they need to maintain the normal range of filtration rate. So that filtration rate has to be maintained. So we have these intrinsic feedback mechanisms that will prevent major changes in the renal blood flow and also glomerular filtration rates. So the glomerular filtration rate will be maintained as long as the blood pressure is within 70 to 160 millimeter of mercury. It means that this is a range in which the autoregulatory mechanisms are very effective. Anything beyond this, the autoregulatory mechanism, they can't really maintain the glomerular filtration rate, and then that will have an effect, whether to increase or to decrease the glomerular filtration rate. So as long as the blood pressure is within 70 to 160, certain textbooks, they can go as high as 180 millimeter of mercury. The autoregulatory mechanism, they will function to maintain the renal blood flow and also the glomerular filtration rate. So without autoregulatory mechanism, you find that slight changes in blood pressure will cause significant change in glomerular filtration rate because there are no autoregulatory mechanism. So it means that they are very important to maintain the glomerular filtration rate so that it stays within the normal range. This diagram here is just summarizing the autoregulatory mechanism. So as long as the blood pressure, you can see down here, you have mean arterial renal artery blood pressure. So as long as the mean pressure in the renal artery is maintained within 80 to somewhere about 170, 180 millimeter of mercury, the autoregulatory mechanism, they are very effective in this range. So anything below 80, the autoregulatory mechanism, they are not very strong. So the glomerular filtration rate will decrease. Then if the blood pressure is greater than 180 millimeter of mercury, the autoregulatory mechanism will fail also to maintain the glomerular filtration rate. But otherwise, as long as the blood pressure is maintained between 80 to 180, the autoregulatory mechanism, they're very effective. When we are looking at cardiovascular system, I told you to say the diastolic pressure divided by, you have systolic pressure divided by diastolic pressure, or which we said is 120 over 80. So on average, the systolic pressure is somewhere around 120. So if that 120 is changing, maybe it's becoming 140, 150, the autoregulatory mechanism will still maintain the normal range of glomerular filtration rate. But if that pressure is greater than 180, then these autoregulatory mechanisms, they can't maintain the glomerular filtration rate. They will fail to function. Then even if it's also reducing beyond 80, it's very difficult for them to maintain. Okay, but in this range, it will be maintained. So there are two autoregulatory mechanisms that you need to know: the myogenic mechanism and the tubuloglomerular feedback mechanism. So the myogenic mechanism, it's the characteristic of smooth muscle cells. Remember, the blood vessels, they have smooth muscle cells. So when you stretch smooth muscle cells, they have a tendency to contract. So even the afferent arterioles that are supplying blood to the kidney nephron, they also have smooth muscle cells. When the blood pressure increases, they will be stretched. The more they are stretched, the more they are going to contract. When they are contracting, resistance is going to increase, blood flow is going to reduce. So you find that it's going to regulate blood pressure and also blood flow to the kidneys. So that is called myogenic mechanism. Then you have tuberoglomerular mechanism, where the juxtaglomerular apparatus is involved, the macular denser cells, and the granular cells that are producing renin. So I'll explain this and then we'll end from here. Okay, so we proceed. So let's start with the myogenic mechanism of autoregulation. The arterial smooth muscle contracts and relaxes in response to increases and decreases in vascular wall tension. So if the vascular wall, there is tension because of an increase in blood pressure, or there is a decrease in tension, the smooth muscle cells, they're going to respond to that. Like I've already explained to say, the smooth muscle cells, they have mechanosensitive ion channels that can open due to stretching. So this myogenic mechanism, it will contribute up to 50% of total autoregulatory response. So 50% of total autoregulatory response is provided by the myogenic mechanism. Myo means muscle. So these are smooth muscle cells that are responding to changes in blood pressure. Hence the name myogenic mechanism. So it occurs very rapidly, reaching a full response within 3 to 10 seconds. So it's very fast. If blood pressure increases now, within 3 to 10 seconds, the autoregulatory mechanism, by the myogenic mechanism, they're going to reduce the blood flow to the kidneys within 3 to 10 seconds. It's very fast. So it is a property of the preglomerular resistance vessels, which is the arcuate arteries, the interlobar or the interlobular artery, and also the afferent arteries. So there are changes in vasoconstriction and vasodilatation in response to blood pressure changes as well. Okay, so how does it take place? So this myogenic response is not seen in the efferent arterioles, but mainly in the afferent arterioles. So the efferent arterioles, it's because maybe they don't have voltage-gated sensitive channels, like for calcium. So the efferent is not mainly involved in the myogenic mechanism of autoregulation, but the afferent that is bringing blood to the kidney nephron. It's the one that is involved in myogenic mechanism of autoregulation. So let's start. If you have an increase in the blood pressure, that will cause an increase in the arterial, in the afferent arteriolar blood pressure. So in the afferent arteriolar blood pressure is also going to increase when you have an increase in blood pressure. Then the arterial wall will be stretched. So there will be stretch on the arterial wall. The sensing by myogenic stretch receptors is going to increase because we have the mechanosensitive receptors in the smooth muscle cells that will be sensing the stretching or the tension. So there will be an increase in the sensing by the myogenic stretch receptors. Then there will be opening of voltage-gated calcium channels. So the ones that are opening first are the stretch-sensitive ion channels that can allow influx of calcium or sodium that will bring about depolarization, and that depolarization will cause the opening of voltage-gated calcium channels that are sensitive to the change in voltage. So the calcium now will start entering the cells, the smooth muscle cells. The influx of calcium from the extracellular fluid compartment into the vesicular smooth muscle cells, then it will cause contraction of smooth muscle cells. You know, to say this calcium will go and bind to camodulin. Calcium camodulin complex will go and activate the myosin head chain kinase that will phosphorylate the myosin heads, then to bring about interaction between actin and myosin. So you have vasoconstriction because the smooth muscle cells in the blood vessels are going to contract. So you have vasoconstriction that will minimize changes in the afferent arteriolar blood flow. So the blood flow now will be reduced because if you have an increase in blood pressure, the blood flow is going to increase. Then the response there will be vasoconstriction to reduce or to minimize changes in the afferent arteriolar blood flow. Then that will also minimize changes in the glomerular filtration rate. So it will regulate. So the opposite will take place if you have reduction in blood pressure. What you're going to have is vasoconstriction. And vasoconstriction will actually increase you have vasodilatation. So if you have reduction in blood pressure, what you're going to have is vasodilatation. So that vasodilatation will increase the glomerular, the flow to the glomerular. So if you have an increase in hydrostatic pressure, then even the glomerular filtration rate is going to increase. Okay, so these are autoregulatory mechanisms. Then the tuberoglomerular feedback mechanism that is also provided by the kidneys. From the name itself, the tuberoglomerular feedback mechanism. So it means that the kidney tubules are involved, then the glomerulus is also involved. So in the kidney tubules, especially the distal parts of the kidney tubules. So you have the first part of the distal kidney tubules that will contribute the formation of the macular denser cells. Those macular denser cells are the ones that are sensing the presence of sodium. So they are sodium sensitive cells, the macular denser cells. Then they can communicate with the smooth muscle cells of the glomeruli. So they can bring about vasoconstriction, vasodilatation, and also contraction of the mesangial cells. Then they can also either stimulate or inhibit the granular cells to release a lot of renin, or to inhibit the release of renin, depending on the effect or the stimuli. So I'm going to explain that. So the tuberoglomerular feedback, the kidney changes its own blood flow in response to changes in sodium concentration. So I'll speed up so that I finish. So the sodium chloride levels in the urinary filtrate are sensed by the macular denser cells at the end of the ascending limb or the loop of Henle. This is the distal convoluted tubule, the first part of the distal convoluted tubule. That's why you find the macular denser cells. So when sodium levels are moderately increased, so when the sodium levels are increased in simple terms, the macular denser cells will release ATP, and then they will reduce the production of prostaglandins, E2, to the juxtaglomerular cells nearby. So this is some kind of paracrine communication, whereby one cell is producing chemicals which are called cytokines, then those cytokines or chemicals will have an effect on the nearby cell. That is called paracrine communication. So if the macular denser cells, they are sensing a lot of sodium, they are going to release a lot of ATP, they are going to release a lot of ADP, and they are going to reduce the production of prostaglandins. And you know to say that the prostaglandins, they are vasodilators. So when you have a lot of prostaglandins, the smooth muscle cells are going to relax. So here, because you want to have more vasoconstriction, so you find that the production of prostaglandin is going to reduce. But what's the actual mechanism? Let me explain from the diagram for everyone to understand from this diagram. So this is a tuberoglomerular mechanism, which involves the feedback mechanisms. So now, I told you to say that the juxtaglomerular apparatus, you have the contribution from the distal tubule. So you can see the distal tubule here. You have these epithelium cells and then modified epithelium cells. So the modified epithelium cells, they'll form the macular denser. So macular denser cells are modified epithelium cells. Then adjacent to these macular denser cells, you have the structures of the glomerulus. That's why it's called the tuberoglomerular mechanism, feedback mechanism. It can communicate with the cells of the glomerulus. Which cells are those? We have the smooth muscle cells of the afferent arterioles. We also have smooth muscle cells of the efferent arterioles. Then we have the mesangial cells. These are called extraglomerular mesangium. So these are mesangial cells that can also respond. So how does it work? So if you have an increase in blood pressure, you know to say that glomerular filtration is going to increase as well, because you have an increase in blood pressure. That increase in blood pressure, the movement of the fluid in the lumen, it will be very fast, especially in the proximal convoluted tubule. So the proximal convoluted tubule won't have enough time to reabsorb much of the sodium. So much of the sodium that is supposed to be reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule, because of the blood pressure has increased, the glomerular filtration rate has increased, even the flow rate of the urine is going to increase. So much of the sodium won't be reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule. So this sodium now will be delivered to the distal convoluted tubule. So in the distal convoluted tubule, this is where you find the macular denser cells. So if you have an increase in the sodium in the lumen here, they are going to sense the increase in the concentration of sodium. That will translate to say that the blood pressure has increased. So what do? They are going to release ATP and ADP. So ATP and ADP will cause vasoconstriction. It will stimulate the smooth muscle cell to contract. Then it will inhibit the contraction of, it will also stimulate the contraction of the mesangial cells, but it will inhibit the release of prostaglandins. Remember, I said the prostaglandins, they will cause smooth muscle relaxation. So what you want to have here is vasoconstriction. So the ATP, it will be broken down into ADP and inorganic phosphates. The ADP and also the other ADPs that are coming from the other reactions, they are going to stimulate these smooth muscle cells to contract, because a byproduct from these ATP, it's adenosine. So that adenosine, it has got a receptor on these smooth muscle cells. It can go and bind to adenosine receptor that will bring about contraction of these smooth muscle cells. So the afferent smooth muscle cells, they are going to contract. You're going to have vasoconstriction. If you have vasoconstriction, the blood flow is going to reduce. Once the blood flow is reducing, the filtration is also reducing. Okay? So it will have an effect on the glomerular filtration rate. Then at the same time, you have the renin secreting cells. So the renin secreting cells are the ones that are secreting renin. And you know to say renin is the one that will bring about vasoconstriction. So when the macular denser cells are sensing a lot of sodium, it will inhibit the release of prostaglandins, and at the same time, it will inhibit the release of, it will actually enhance, it will inhibit the release of renin to some extent, because renin is supposed to be produced when there is hypotension, when the blood pressure is reducing. So the production of renin is going to reduce as well when the macular denser cells are sensing a lot of sodium. Okay? If you still don't understand, there are a lot of diagrams that are explaining that. So if you have a decrease, this is the opposite now. If you have a decrease in the arterial pressure, it means that the glomerular filtration pressure is also going to decrease. So you can see that the glomerular filtration rate is also reducing here because the pressure is reducing. Then there will be an increase in the reabsorption of sodium and water in the proximal convoluted tubule. So the macular denser cells won't be sensing a lot of sodium. So what do? So they will increase now. They will stimulate the cells that will produce a lot of renin, and that renin will convert the angiotensinogen into angiotensin, that will be converted into angiotensin 2. Then the angiotensin 2 will cause vasoconstriction of the afferent arteriole, of the efferent arterioles. So you have an increase in the efferent resistance. So you have an increase in the efferent resistance, then you have this vasoconstriction of the efferent arterioles. So the vasoconstriction of the efferent arteriole, you know to say, is going to increase the glomerular filtration rate. So remember, it was reducing, but now it's going to increase because you have vasoconstriction of the efferent arterioles. So the angiotensin 2, it has got an effect on the efferent arterioles and less effect on the afferent arterioles. Why? It's because the efferent arterioles are the ones that will have a lot of angiotensin 2 receptors. Then it will also send another signal to the smooth muscle cells. So you can see there's a signal to the afferent arterioles. So the release of ADP and ATP will reduce. You have less adenosine. If you have less adenosine, it means that the smooth muscle cells won't be stimulated to contract, so they're going to relax. So the smooth muscle cells or the afferent, they're going to relax. That will bring about vasodilatation to increase blood flow and blood flow to the glomerulus. So once you increase blood flow to the glomerulus, you know to say the glomerular filtration rate is also going to increase. Okay, so we are almost done. So this is the mechanism of the macular denser cells. So you have the macular denser cells that are sensing the presence of sodium. So we said if you have an increase in blood pressure, the glomerular filtration rate is going to increase. Then the proximal convoluted tubule won't reabsorb much of the sodium. So that sodium will be delivered to the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubule, they have sodium chloride 2. They have sodium chloride potassium transporter proteins that are going to internalize or to reabsorb sodium. So the more sodium they are reabsorbing, these macular denser cells, they will release ATP and adenosine. So the ATP will be broken down into adenosine and other products. The adenosine is the one that will go and bind to adenosine receptor. Then this receptor is a G protein coupled receptor that can also mobilize calcium. So there will be an increase in calcium concentration in these smooth muscle cells. When you have a lot of this calcium, it will bring about vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction, it means it's minimizing blood flow to the kidneys. So you're also regulating blood pressure to the kidneys. The sympathetics, of course, you have norepinephrine that will have an effect on the smooth muscle cells of blood vessels. And you know to say that norepinephrine and epinephrine can cause vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction of the afferent arterioles. Then the parasympathetics, they are going to release acetylcholine that will cause the opposite. Then there's also production of nitric oxide that can result into relaxation of smooth muscle cells. Remember, the endothelial relaxation factor of smooth muscle cells, nitric oxide. So when we meet